Okay, so we're diving into something a little different today, something really fascinating.
Yeah.
We're looking at this handbook. It's called Coming Out, a handbook for LGBTQ young people from the Trevor Project.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah. And I thought it'd be interesting to, kind of go beyond those like basic definitions we often hear and really get into some of the nuances,
Yeah.
like the stuff about identity and the practical advice they give.
And you know what's interesting about this handbook is that even though it's like specifically aimed at young people, a lot of the insights and stuff are actually like super relevant to anyone. Like if you're figuring this stuff out yourself, or even if you're like supporting someone who is.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, so like right away the handbook, it challenges that like, that simple boy-girl thing, the gender binary. And it does it visually too.
Yeah, those visuals are so cool. The spectrum diagrams,
Yeah.
really helpful for understanding like the difference between, sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and then gender expression. Shows how they're not always like lined up.
Right, right. And there's this quote that really stuck with me. It says, "The label of one's sex assignment at birth is often attributed to a child before they can speak, walk, or know for themselves what their gender identity is."
Wow. Yeah.
Like, it makes you think, right?
Huh?
We're putting these labels on people before they even have a chance to, like, figure themselves out.
It's true. And like, think about the impact that has, later on, like how that early labeling might make people feel pressure to just like fit in with those labels.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there's this whole topic of transitioning, which the handbook explains really well. I like how they emphasize that it's a personal choice. It's not like a requirement or anything. And it can take so many different forms.
Totally. And it's not just about gender identity either. Like they bring up intersex people,
Oh, right.
which reminds us that, bodies are diverse. We don't talk about that enough.
Totally, totally. We do like to put people in these neat little boxes, don't we?
Ah,
Okay, so moving on to sexual orientation. The handbook breaks down those four main types of attraction: sexual, physical, romantic, emotional, the whole deal. But it goes beyond like just giving definitions. They use these visuals, these maps, to actually represent how attraction can be like fluid and multifaceted.
those maps are so helpful. They really make it click.
Yeah.
Like how someone might be, let's say, super romantically attracted to one gender, but when it comes to sexual attraction, totally different experience.
Right, right. It's like everyone's experience is unique, and that's totally valid. No one size fits all when it comes to attraction.
Exactly. And speaking of unique experiences, it's a perfect segue into the whole topic of coming out, which is such a big part of the handbook. And they really stress that, it's a deeply personal thing. No right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah, but they do give you different methods, right? Like
Yeah.
everything from just casual conversations to those like big formal announcements.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And what I found really helpful is the idea of like testing the waters before you actually come out. Just kind of see how someone might react to certain topics. Like maybe there's a movie with an LGBTQ character or a news story, something like that. Can help you kind of gauge their views.
Oh, that's smart. Like a little trial run.
Yeah, exactly. And that can give you a better sense of like whether or not they're going to be supportive.
Right, right. Okay, so let's say you are ready to come out. The handbook actually gives some pretty practical guidance, particularly if you're worried about a negative reaction, especially when it comes to planning and safety.
Yeah, for sure. Like, really think about your environment when you want to do it, who you're telling. It makes a big difference, especially if you're like in a school setting, where safety's a real concern.
Right. And speaking of school, they mention those, what are they called? The GSAs, the Gender and Sexuality Alliances.
Yeah.
Yeah. As potential like safe spaces, right. But they also don't sugarcoat things. They acknowledge that not all reactions are going to be positive.
Unfortunately, that's true, which is why having a support system is so important. Even if it's just one or two people you can really trust, it doesn't even have to be people in your like immediate circle. The handbook talks about how online communities can be super helpful too, especially if you're feeling isolated.
It's like building your own like
Mm.
safety net, right?
Yeah.
Having people you can count on. But it's not just about like external support, right? The handbook also talks a lot about self-care.
Oh, yeah, big time. It has a whole section dedicated to it because they recognize how emotionally draining this whole process can be. And get this, they don't just tell you to journal. They actually give you specific prompts, like tailored for LGBTQ youth.
Oh, wow. Like to help you kind of process things.
Yeah. To reflect on your feelings, explore your identity, and like celebrate your strengths. It's really cool.
So it's like much more than just like bubble baths and face masks, right?
Right. It's about actually nurturing your mental and emotional health, being proactive.
I love that. That's a great point. It's like building that inner strength. Okay, so we've talked about support systems, self-care, but there's this other big piece, healthy relationships. It's something the handbook touches on, but I think we should really unpack it, especially in the context of coming out.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a whole other conversation, right?
Exactly. And I'm really curious to see how the handbook delves into that, like how coming out can affect existing relationships, both good and bad.
So, we were just talking about support systems, and it really ties in with this whole idea of healthy relationships, which the handbook really
Right.
emphasizes.
It does, doesn't it? It's
Uh,
like when you come out, it can kind of put your existing relationships to the test,
yeah.
see how strong they really are.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good point, actually. And the handbook does a great job of like laying out what makes a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy one. And it's not just about romantic relationships either. It's like friendships, family dynamics, even your relationship with yourself.
Oh, that's interesting. So what are like the key things they highlight for a healthy relationship?
Well, it all starts with the basics, trust, respect, open communication, feeling safe and secure, like knowing you can be yourself, you can express your feelings, and that the other person is really listening really gets you.
And boundaries, right? Those are important too.
Oh, huge. Healthy relationships have clear boundaries. The handbook actually points out that in unhealthy relationships, there's often this element of control.
Huh.
It can be physical or emotional or even sexual.
That's kind of scary to think about, but it's good to be aware of those red flags. And I think this is where the handbook's discussion of consent comes in, right? Making sure it's enthusiastic, freely given. You always have the right to say no.
Yes, absolutely. And, consent isn't just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing conversation. It's not about pressure or like making someone do something they don't want to do.
Right. The handbook doesn't shy away from the tough stuff either.
Mm.
It talks about things like violence or coercion or force, in unhealthy relationships. It can be hard to read about, but it's important to know that those things are not okay. Not okay at all.
And it's like the handbook doesn't just leave you hanging, it actually encourages anyone who's going through something like that to seek help. And they even give you resources to do that, which is so important.
Yeah, like you're not alone in this. So it's interesting how the handbook brings it all back to the coming out process, acknowledging that it can put a strain on your relationships, especially if those relationships aren't really built on acceptance and support.
And it's not always about people being intentionally mean or anything. Sometimes people just have a hard time understanding things that are different from their own experiences. Like they might even be dealing with their own internalized homophobia or transphobia.
Oh, that's a good point. Internalized homophobia and transphobia. That can create so many barriers, both for the individual and in relationships.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're fighting this battle within yourself, which can make it even harder to deal with external challenges. And that's where, building a strong support network, both internally and externally, becomes so crucial. Having those people you can trust, you can rely on.
It's like having a safety net, right?
Yeah.
But even with a good support system, this whole process, coming out and navigating all these complicated issues, it can be really emotionally draining.
No doubt. And that's why the handbook dedicates so much space to self-care, because it's not just a nice to have, it's essential, especially when you're going through times of stress and transition. And get this, they actually offer strategies that are specifically tailored for LGBTQ youth, which is really cool.
Like what kind of stuff? Can you give an example?
So one thing that really stood out to me was the section on mindfulness and grounding techniques. And it explains how these techniques can help you manage anxiety and stress, which are really common for, LGBTQ young people, especially during the coming out process. They even give you step-by-step instructions for things like simple breathing exercises and body scan meditations.
Oh, wow. So it's not just like go practice self-care. They actually give you the tools to do it.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's actually about making sure you're at your best so you can show up for yourself and for the people you care about.
I like that. Okay, so we talked about healthy relationships, both with others and with ourselves. But what about those relationships that maybe get strained or even broken because of coming out? Does the handbook address that at all?
Yeah, definitely. And while it acknowledges that not all relationships survive the coming out process, which can be really sad, it does give you some advice on how to handle those tricky situations, like setting boundaries, being clear about your needs, and recognizing when it might be time to walk away from a relationship that's just not healthy.
Wow, that must be so tough, especially when it's like family members.
It can be heartbreaking for sure, but the handbook reminds you that you deserve to be surrounded by people who truly love and accept you for who you are. And sometimes that means letting go of relationships that are just bringing you down.
It's like sometimes choosing yourself means choosing to walk away, even if it hurts.
It's a hard lesson, but it's an important one. So, while the handbook talks a lot about these external support systems, it also stresses the importance of building that inner strength, that self-acceptance.
Yeah, because if you don't have that strong foundation of self-love, it's going to be even harder to deal with those challenges that might come up when you come out.
You got it. It's about building that resilience, so you can weather any storm. And that brings us to something we haven't really talked about yet, but it's super important: mental health.
Okay, yeah, so let's talk about that. I'm curious to see what the handbook says, especially, given everything we've been talking about with coming out and building healthy relationships. We've been talking about all this stuff about taking care of yourself and having healthy relationships, especially for LGBTQ youth who are figuring out how to come out. But I feel like mental health is a big part of this whole conversation too, right? What does the handbook say about
Oh,
that?
for sure. It's all connected. And actually, the handbook has a whole section on mental health because they know this can be a tough time for young people.
Yeah, it's got to be pretty intense,
Yeah.
all the emotions of coming out, and then you add in the possibility of people not accepting you or even discriminating against you.
Yeah, and the handbook doesn't try to pretend it's all sunshine and rainbows. They're upfront that, you might feel sad sometimes or anxious, maybe even depressed. Those feelings are normal, but they also make it clear that those everyday feelings are different from, serious mental health concerns.
So how do they help you figure out the difference?
Well, they give you a list of warning signs to watch for, like, have your sleep patterns change? Are you not interested in things you used to love? Do you feel hopeless, all the time? Or even, think about hurting yourself. It's almost like a checklist, to see if maybe you need to talk to a professional.
That's so smart, having those clear signs.
Yeah.
It can help you get help if needed, or even help someone else.
And it's not just about knowing the signs. It's about knowing where to go for help. The handbook lists a bunch of mental health resources, like hotlines and support groups, and even online therapy. And of course, they mention the Trevor Project's own crisis services, which are available 24/7.
Yeah, good reminder. You're not alone in this. There's help out there. But even beyond those crisis situations, the handbook talks about taking care of your mental health all the time. It's not just when things are bad, but as part of your overall well-being. Kind of like you take care of your physical health.
I love that. Instead of waiting for a problem, you're taking care of yourself.
Right, exactly. And that connects back to all that stuff about self-care, doesn't it?
Big time. Self-care is crucial for good mental health. And I love that the handbook goes beyond the usual stuff. They give you a bunch of different strategies to try.
What kind of stuff are we talking about?
Okay, so one of my favorites is this idea of making a self-love playlist. Put together all those songs that make you feel good, songs that make you feel strong and remind you that you're awesome. It's such a cool idea, using music to help you love yourself.
That's so creative. I love it. It's like your own personal soundtrack for self-discovery.
Yeah, and that's not all. They also talk about things like spending time outdoors, being in nature or practicing gratitude or even just unplugging from all the technology and giving yourself a break. It's really about figuring out what works for you.
Give yourself permission to experiment. See what feeds your soul. So we've covered a lot of ground here, mental health, self-care, relationships. As we wrap up our deep dive into this handbook, what's the one big thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
I'd say the most important thing is remember, you are not alone. No matter where you are in your journey, no matter what you're going through, there are people who care about you, there are resources to help you, and there's a whole community out there ready to welcome you.
It's such a powerful message. It's there's hope, and you can get through this. It reminds me of that quote from the handbook. It says, this handbook is a reminder that no matter where you are in your journey, you deserve to be celebrated for who you truly are.
It's true. You deserve to be celebrated just as you are.
And if you ever need someone to talk to, don't forget the Trevor Project is there for you. You can call, text, or chat online 24/7.
Reach out, get support. You deserve love and a happy, authentic life.